German soldiers had a joke in Normandy. If you see silver aeroplanes, they're American. If you see brown ones, they're British. And if you don't see any at all, they're ours. That wasn't a joke. That was a confession. By June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had already been hunted to extinction. But here's the thing about those brown planes the Germans were seeing, the ones they called British. A lot of them weren't British at all. They were Canadian, Australian, New Zealander. Scan the squadron markings on those Typhoons screaming over the Norman hedgerows. Look at the Typhoons diving on German convoys. Check the bomber crews flying night raids over the Reich. You'll find Commonwealth pilots from one end of the European theatre to the other. Pilots from Canada, pilots from Australia, New Zealanders. A force so thoroughly integrated into RAF operations that American documentaries still lump them together as British when they bother to acknowledge them at all. This is the story American histories don't tell. Not because it's classified, not because it's controversial, because it complicates the narrative. The clean story of American industrial might and American fighting spirit doesn't have room for the inconvenient truth that victory in the skies over Europe was a coalition effort, that Canadian taxpayers underwrote billions of dollars worth of equipment that filled those European skies, that Canadian pilots flew, fought and died alongside their British and Commonwealth counterparts. When German soldiers told their bitter joke about planes they never saw, they were acknowledging a defeat that Canada helped engineer. But when the documentaries get made, when the histories get written, when the story of D-Day gets told for the 100th time, funny how Canada becomes a footnote while American generals get the screen time. Let's fix that. To understand Canada's contribution to D-Day, you have to understand what was happening in the skies over Europe in the months before the invasion. The strategic air campaign, the systematic destruction of German industry and, more importantly, German air power, wasn't a sideshow to the ground war. It was the prerequisite. Every military planner in the Allied command structure understood with crystalline clarity that the Normandy landings would fail if the Luftwaffe retained the ability to contest those beaches. The invasion fleet would burn. The landing craft would be slaughtered in the surf. The paratroopers would be massacred on the drop zones. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, understood this with crystalline clarity. Air supremacy over France before the first soldier waded ashore. Everything depended on it. The problem was that as 1943 drew to a close, that supremacy was far from assured. The Luftwaffe was wounded, but it wasn't dead. German fighter pilots, veterans who'd learned their craft over Spain, Poland, France and the Eastern Front, still rose to meet the waves of American bombers droning toward the Reich. On October 14, 1943, during the second Schweinfurt raid, American bomber crews suffered such devastating casualties that the mission became known as Black Thursday. 60 B-17 shot down, another 138 damaged. The Americans had proved that daylight precision bombing was possible, but they'd also proved it might be suicidal. Something had to change. And in January 1944, it did. Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and implemented a doctrinal shift that would shape everything that followed. The previous approach treated escort fighters as defensive instruments. Their job was to protect the bombers, stay in formation, fend off attackers. If a Messerschmitt made a pass and then peeled away, American pilots were under orders to let it go. Doolittle looked at this arrangement and saw its fatal flaw. The target was never the factories. The target was the men. Here's the math. You couldn't destroy German industry faster than the Germans could disperse and rebuild it. Those aircraft factories, even under constant bombardment, continued producing fighters at impressive rates throughout 1944. But you could destroy German pilots faster than the Germans could train replacements. The training pipeline that had produced the Experten, the legendary aces of the early war, had been compressed and degraded by years of attrition. New pilots arrived at frontline units with frighteningly few flying hours. Kill the pilots and the factories became irrelevant. Doolittle released the fighters. They were no longer nursemaids, they were killers. Their job was to find the Luftwaffe and destroy it. In the air, on the ground, at its airfields, in its hangars. The bombers became bait. The targets were real. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic fuel facilities. But the deeper purpose was to force the Luftwaffe to rise and fight. When the German fighters rose, the escorts would be waiting. And who was flying those escorts? Who was crewing those bombers? The American documentaries show you 8th Air Force patches and talk about Jimmy Doolittle's tactical genius. What they don't show you is that the Royal Air Force and its Commonwealth squadrons had fought the air war over Europe since 1940, 3 years before the Americans arrived in force. RAF Bomber Command, with its British, Canadian, Australian and New Zealand crews, flew alongside American units in the relentless campaign that bled the Luftwaffe white before a single Allied soldier stepped onto French sand. The exchange rates tell the story. During Big Week, the massive air offensive launched in late February 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces threw everything they had at German aircraft industry, flying missions that deliberately invited Luftwaffe interception. 226 American bombers lost, 28 fighters. But here's the thing about exchange rates. The Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 pilots between January and April 1944. Not aircraft, pilots. The men who knew how to fight. The highest-scoring graduates from German flight schools had attrition rates around 6%. The lowest-scoring graduates, more than 70%. More than 7 out of 10 dead before they learned enough to survive. The Allies were feeding green German pilots into a meat grinder that the Experten could no longer protect them from. And Commonwealth crews were part of that meat grinder every night, every mission, every sortie. The 8th Air Force destroyed 18,512 enemy aircraft during the war. That statistic gets quoted in American histories as American achievement. What doesn't get quoted? How many of those aircraft fell to Commonwealth guns, Commonwealth bombs, pilots flying under RAF markings that American audiences assumed were British? There's a reason for this erasure, and it's not malicious. It's just easier. American audiences want American heroes. American documentaries need American protagonists. The complexity of coalition warfare, the messy reality that victory required Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Poles, Free French, and a dozen other nationalities fighting alongside Americans and British, doesn't fit the narrative structure of a 90-minute film. So it gets simplified, streamlined, and in the streamlining, Canada disappears. But the numbers don't lie. According to Commonwealth records, Canada's wartime financial contribution included $4 billion worth of transported equipment, though these figures are disputed by some historians. Adjust that for inflation, and you're looking at figures that dwarf the entire military budgets of most modern nations. Aircraft, vehicles, ammunition, fuel. The industrial output of a nation transformed in 5 years into an arsenal that kept Allied forces supplied across 2 oceans. And here's the part that really gets erased. Canada wrote off roughly $500 million of that debt entirely. In 1945 dollars, gone. A contribution to the war effort that American histories somehow forget to mention when tallying who contributed what to victory. $500 million simply written off. Try to find that figure in any American D-Day documentary. Good luck. This isn't about diminishing American sacrifice. Americans died on those beaches. Americans flew those bombers. Americans bled and burned and drowned in the English Channel. But so did Canadians. And when the story gets told as if only Americans mattered, when Canadian contributions become a footnote or disappear entirely, something important gets lost. The truth gets lost. The Normandy campaign was a coalition effort. The air superiority that made it possible was achieved by pilots from a dozen nations flying under half a dozen flags. The brown typhoons that German soldiers saw overhead? Many of them carried young men from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Boys who'd grown up skating on frozen ponds or surfing southern beaches and were now hunting Messerschmitts over the Reich. Let's talk about what that air superiority actually meant for the Germans on the ground. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe could field perhaps 1,300 aircraft in the French theatre. And even that number wouldn't be reached until several days after D-Day as reinforcements trickled in. Against this, the Allies had assembled more than 13,000 combat aircraft. 13,000 against 1,300. That's not a contest. That's an execution. On June 6, 1944, the Allies flew 14,674 sorties over Normandy. The Luftwaffe managed 319. Do the math. The ratio of Allied to German sorties was better than 45-1. 2 German fighters, piloted by officers named Priller and Wlodarczyk, famously made a single strafing run along Sword Beach at dawn before fleeing for their lives. Those 2 planes were the only Luftwaffe aircraft most invasion troops saw that day. 2 against 14,000. German soldiers had been promised air support. Unit histories reveal they expected the Luftwaffe to flood into France for the decisive air battle when the invasion came. This expectation wasn't merely optimistic, it was detached from operational reality. The Luftwaffe was already dead. Doolittle's campaign had bled it white. Commonwealth night bombers had helped destroy its infrastructure. Commonwealth pilots had helped shoot down its planes. And now, on the most important day of the war, German soldiers scanned empty skies for aircraft that didn't exist. Imagine being in a Panzer division without air cover. D-Day was a foregone conclusion. The unbelievable thing, the thing that testified to something in German military culture that transcended rationality, was that German forces continued to fight at all. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armoured formation close enough to counterattack on D-Day, attempted to move toward the coast and found itself under constant air attack. By the end of June 6th, the 21st Panzers had lost 54 of their 124 tanks. Not all to air attack, but enough that the survivors understood what awaited any unit attempting to operate in daylight. The counterattack that might have thrown the Allied beachheads back into the sea never materialized. Not primarily because of ground combat, because the ground forces couldn't reach the fight without being destroyed from above. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound and immediate. This was, in the words of one German military historian, a completely new experience for most German soldiers. Veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets also achieved air superiority in later years, thought they understood what it meant to operate under enemy-controlled skies. They were wrong. The Eastern Front Air War, for all its scale, never approached the concentrated intensity awaiting them in Normandy. And yes, the Luftwaffe bled heavily in the East too. That attrition contributed to what the Western Allies finished. But Normandy was different. The skies weren't merely contested, they were owned. German soldiers caught in the open during daylight experienced a new form of warfare in which the sky itself became the enemy. The Jabos, Jagdbomber, fighter bombers, would appear without warning. The screaming dive, the explosion of cannon fire and rockets, burning vehicles lighting the Norman hedgerows like funeral pyres. Camouflage techniques developed for ground combat proved useless against pilots at 10,000 feet. A tank invisible to infantry at 1,000 meters was perfectly visible from the air. The dust plume raised by a column of vehicles could be spotted from miles away. German units learned to move only at night, disperse during daylight, avoid roads entirely, and travel cross-country through hedgerows and forests. But these adaptations reduced operational tempo to a crawl. A division that required 3 days to move a distance it could have covered in 6 hours was a division that couldn't execute rapid counterattacks. The vaunted German soldier, trained to seize the initiative, found himself pinned like an insect to a board. Movement meant death. Concentration meant death. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, had seen what Allied air power could do in North Africa. He understood that massed armour couldn't operate if the Allies owned the skies. His views clashed with other German commanders who believed in concentrated Panzer reserves held back from the coast, ready to counterattack once the invasion's main axis was identified. Rommel knew better. Any reserve force attempting to move in daylight would be destroyed from the air before it reached the battle. The argument was academic anyway. Both defensive approaches assumed a level of operational mobility that Allied air superiority made impossible. There's another uncomfortable truth about those skies over Normandy, a truth the triumphalist narratives prefer to skip. Air superiority was so total that it created its own problems. Specifically, Allied aircraft kept shooting at each other and at Allied ground forces. The density of air traffic over the beachheads made catastrophic friendly fire incidents not just possible, but inevitable. That's why every Allied aircraft received those distinctive alternating black and white stripes on their wings and fuselages. The invasion stripes you see in every D-Day photograph. The paint wasn't decorative. It was a desperate attempt to prevent typhoons from strafing American tanks, to keep thunderbolts from shooting down British bombers, to give pilots some way, any way, of distinguishing friend from foe in those crowded, chaotic skies. Even with the stripes, mistakes happened. An Australian pilot's log from the invasion period contains a note that captures the dark absurdity perfectly. Yanks very apologetic. That's 4 words that tell you more about the reality of air superiority than any statistics could. The Allies had so many aircraft over the battle area that coordination became a problem of its own. American guns shooting at British planes, British bombs falling on American positions. Canadian aircraft caught in the crossfire. Everyone involved understanding that this was the price of owning the sky so completely that you couldn't keep track of your own people. The Germans, watching all this from their foxholes, must have found it grimly amusing. The Allies had so many aircraft they couldn't stop shooting at each other. Meanwhile, German soldiers scanned empty horizons for a Luftwaffe that existed mostly in propaganda newsreels. There's something worth understanding about why they kept fighting. The Wehrmacht soldier in June 1944 wasn't stupid. He could count aircraft. He could see the burning vehicles. He could recognize that his leaders had promised air support that didn't exist. And yet, he continued to resist for months after D-Day, making the Allies pay for every hedgerow, every village, every river crossing. Part of it was the Nazi regime's apparatus of coercion. Desertion meant death. Surrender was complicated when enemy aircraft might strafe you before you could raise your hands. But there was something else too. Something in German military culture that kept men fighting even when the tactical situation was hopeless. Call it professionalism. Call it stubbornness. Call it the absurd courage of soldiers who'd been trained to believe that initiative and aggression could overcome any disadvantage. It couldn't overcome 45-1 odds in the air, but they tried anyway. The joke about the planes spread through Wehrmacht units during those summer months. Silver American, brown British, none at all German. Gallows humour. The kind of bitter comedy that lets soldiers acknowledge their situation without breaking down. Every German soldier who told that joke was admitting what their commanders couldn't say publicly. The Luftwaffe was gone. The skies belonged to the enemy. D-Day hadn't been a battle for air supremacy because there was nothing left to battle against. But here's the thing about that joke that the German soldiers got wrong. Those brown planes they saw, many of them weren't British. They were Canadian, Australian, New Zealander, boys from across the Commonwealth, flying Typhoons painted in RAF colours, shooting down Messerschmitts, strafing convoys, dying in flames over French farmland. When the German soldier told his joke about brown British planes, he was unwittingly erasing Commonwealth sacrifice, the same erasure that American documentaries would later perfect. The story of D-Day's air superiority is a story of coalition warfare. It's a story of American strategic vision and British industrial capacity, and Canadian financial sacrifice, and Australian pilots, and Polish squadrons, and Free French determination. It's a story that doesn't fit neatly into national narratives because it belongs to everyone who fought and flew and died in those European skies. When historians ask why D-Day succeeded, when they catalogue the factors that allowed the largest amphibious invasion in history to establish a permanent foothold in Western Europe, they should start with the air campaign, not with the beaches, not with the airborne drops, not with Eisenhower's decision to go despite the weather. They should start with the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe in the months before June. They should acknowledge that destruction was achieved by pilots from across the Commonwealth, flying missions that cost thousands of lives before any infantry hit sand. They should recognise that the $4 billion in Canadian equipment, the hundreds of thousands of Commonwealth personnel, the $500 million in written-off debt, all of this was part of why those German soldiers saw only Allied aircraft overhead. And maybe, just maybe, they should stop telling the story as if only Americans mattered. The Germans had a joke in Normandy. Silver planes were American, brown ones were British, and if you didn't see any at all, they were German. They weren't laughing when they told it, and they were wrong about the brown ones anyway. A lot of those brown planes were Canadian, Australian, New Zealander. Subscribe for more stories like this.